All right, welcome this morning, those of you braving the weather. I don't know what it's like in the rest of the state, but the Wasatch Front is pretty socked in with snow. My name is Ari Bruening. I'm with Envision Utah, and this is the first time we've ever done this, the Quality Communities training. So first thing I want to do is figure out who we've got here. So I'm here in Salt Lake. We've got a number of people with us. I think we've got a Logan location out there. So everybody in Logan, raise your hand so I know which ones you are. Yeah, how about Moab? Got a Moab out there?
Hi.
Yeah, how about Richfield? There's Richfield. Who am I missing? There's a Brigham City. Anybody Brigham City? We got one. That's right. That's right. Who am I missing, Ryan?
St. George.
Hayesville.
3 of us in St. George.
And there's St. George. All right. Did I miss anybody else, right? Oh, Orem. How about Orem? Oh, we got a few. All right. I think we got them all. All right. Well, welcome. We're going to go through some presentations first, and then we're going to have questions at the end. And so keep track of your questions so you can ask them at the end. First thing I wanted to do was thank our sponsors for this event. You can see all their logos. There are quite a few. So quite pleased with those who are interested in helping make sure all Utahns understand how to plan for quality communities. So I'm doing the brief introduction. Then we're going to have Wilf Sommerkorn, who's a planner with Salt Lake County, talk a little bit about good design and quality of life. Then we're going to have Patrick Risk, who works in the LDS Church, talk about housing and churches and schools and so on. Then we're going to have Dennis Marker, who's Assistant City Manager at Santaquin, who's going to talk about fiscal sustainability. And then Julie Bjornstad from Wasatch Front Regional Council will talk about how we plan for mobility and access so that people can get around. And then this is an introduction. I'm with Envision Utah. We're 20 years old this year. And we were founded by a broad, diverse group of people, everybody from Mike Levitt to Larry Miller. What they all have in common was they cared about Utah and wanting to make sure we have a high quality of life even as we grow. And if you look at how we're growing, we're almost going to double in population by 2050. And so you ask yourself, what does that mean for traffic? What does that mean for air? What does that mean for creates a lot of challenges. Challenge to happen is that we have a strong economy. The challenge at front is a declining land supply in our major valleys that we've been growing in. The Salt Lake County, we have about left. We're in Davis, even less. Utah County has quite a bit, but it's on the west side of the county and the other side of a lake. So it's some interesting challenges. Going through a statewide visioning process called Your Utah, Your Future, and over 50,000 Utahns weighed in this process and arrived at a vision where we found that Utahns wanted 4 things for the future. They want you to be safe, secure, and resilient, prosperous, neighborly, fair, and caring, and healthy, beautiful, and clean. That's hard to argue with. The question is, how do you get there? And as we studied what Utahns wanted, we came up with 4 cornerstones for the future. So we're going to be focusing today on the network of quality communities, but we also have 3 other cornerstones. One about what we put in those communities, our homes, buildings, landscaping, and cars. Thriving rural Utah, so that all of Utah prospers. And then the 4th is about education, people prepared for the future. So we're working on implementation projects on all 4 of those. And today we're focused on that network of quality communities. And as we went through this process, we worked with experts to put together 4 scenarios for the future. And we varied the housing mix, the location of growth, the transportation modes, and so on. Took them to the public and showed them some of the outcomes from each of the scenarios, like how many acres we would develop, which translates to how much farmland we lose, how many households are close to daily services. We calculated local infrastructure costs and the housing mix and so on. took it to the public, and 82% picked one scenario. So it's hard to get 82% of Utahns to agree on anything, much less how to grow. So pretty good consensus. This is the scenario that Utahns picked. The sort of bluish teal color is existing development. The orange is new development. This is Salt Lake County. And then the yellow dots throughout here are the new mixed-use centers where people can access services. So we're going to talk a bit about that and about how we get to that scenario, what appealed to Utahns about it, and how we develop that way. And so if we do the right things and achieve that scenario, though, we believe that we can keep life convenient, affordable, enjoyable for Utahns, even as we grow, even as we double in population. So today we're going to learn a little bit about how to do that. And I'm going to invite Wilf, you're first. Come up and tell us a little bit about how to design for good quality of life. I think I pass the microphone to you.
Okay. This is Grayson in Richfield. Can I interrupt real quick?
Yes.
Is it possible for the facilitator to do a split screen for us so we can see the presenter as well?
And up in Brigham City, we can't see the screen. Is it possible for us to see whatever the presenter is putting up on
The slides?
screen? Yes, please.
We can see it in Logan.
Yeah, Brigham, you have to find your facilitator, and they can switch that for you.
Thank you.
Okay. Are we ready? Can everybody hear me? I just want to make sure that you all can hear me. Wave if you can hear me. That's great. Okay. Looks like you can. My name is Wilf Sommerkorn. I'm a planner with Salt Lake County. Previously planning director in Salt Lake City. Prior to that, I spent a lot of time in Davis County. And I actually still live in Davis County, Kaysville, if there's anybody at the Kaysville site. When I got on the road this morning, I thought, man, I should just go to the Kaysville site and talk from there because it was a little hairy coming in this morning. First of all, you'll notice Ari was just up here, and I don't know how he got to look like that, given what the weather's like today. This is how I dressed up, and it's Saturday, right? We want to look like this. But wait till you see Patrick and Dennis. Those guys, they're in suits, full suits, so they'll look really good, and you'll recognize their shot. Now, Patrick has an excuse. Patrick's associated with the LDS Church, and they wear their suit and tie to bed. And so he's always wearing it. But, you know, for the rest of us, we kind of try to do something a little different. All right, let's get started a little bit. I want to talk to you, probably just introduce the concept of centers and talk about some of the things related to that. Oh, I'm maybe pushing the wrong button. Tell me which button I'm supposed to push. Should I just do it on here? Oh, that one. Oh, okay. There we go. All right. Well, to understand our future for urban growth, or where we want to go maybe with our future for urban growth, it's helpful to understand how we got here and look a little bit at what happened in our past and maybe use the past to inform our future and maybe help us do it a little bit, something different in our future. So like with so much else, the history of urban Utah really starts with the arrival of the Mormon pioneers in 1847. And we hear that all the time, right? But it's really true in this case. Those pioneers quickly settled into communities, the main one, of course, being Salt Lake City, but others were established very quickly right after that. Ogden was another one, and some would argue that Ogden was here before Salt Lake because you had Fort Buenaventura, so there's a case for that. But, for example, Bountiful was established in the fall of 1847, and so a number of these communities were established as kind of the centers for where people were being sent out to kind of settle and create communities of their own. And these communities then served as the center for the residents or for the people that were living in that area. For the rarer goods, for the bigger things that people might need, for the bigger social and cultural events that might be taking place, kind of had a hierarchy of centers. You'd go to the bigger community, with the biggest in the region, of course, being Salt Lake City. and being the main hub. And that's, that's where you would really get the important stuff that you might need that might not be out in those smaller centers or come for those events, for those social activities, for those other things that might be occurring that were really of a regional scale. And that's a pattern that was, fairly typical in much of the western part of the country as it was settled with kind of this hierarchy of centers. As the population grew, we got more people spread out, and farming, agriculture, a big part of what they were doing. Other centers also arose then and were established to help serve those people that were located in those areas. A number of communities were established over the years in this way, places like Murray and Sandy and Farmington, to provide those services, those things, those cultural and social things as well that people that were living in those areas would need and would be close to, relatively close to, as the population increased and we got more people living throughout the whole area. That was the pattern. And it pretty much stayed that way for a period of time until the way we traveled started to change. Of course, horsepower was the big way that people traveled, but individual horses and so on. But pretty soon we got trolleys on tracks that were horse-powered, which made things a little bit quicker and more convenient and a little bit more established. And then eventually we got to electrical power and had electrical trolleys. Pretty soon we had those motor vehicles, those internal combustion engines, and we started getting motorized vehicles, trolleys motorized as well as individual motorized vehicles. And with this new means of transportation, people could get to places faster, which meant they could live further away. And so it kind of meant that we didn't have to establish quite as many centers as before, because now people could live further away and still get to the center relatively quickly in a reasonable amount of time. And that technology really allowed something to happen over a period of years that we all are very familiar with today, and some love and some hate: the suburbs. Dun, yeah, somebody just in here just went dun, dun, dun. So yes, the suburbs, where we really have a lot of people living over a large area, but not a lot of centers, not a lot of locations for those services and for those goods that we may need. Just jump on that trolley or jump in that car, buzz into the center that's maybe a little bit further away, but hey, you know what? You can get there relatively quickly. Well, that worked pretty well, as long as there weren't a whole lot of people and a whole lot of cars and a whole lot of people in those cars. But as we well know, we kept growing. We kept getting more and more people. And those roads had to get bigger and bigger, and pretty soon, it didn't really seem to matter how big we made those roads. They always seemed to be crowded and clogged. And eventually, we just have too many people trying to get to those too few centers for work, for the services, for the goods and things that they need. And it kind of made life a little bit more difficult. I don't know where it is. Could be here somewhere. Watch out, it's going to be us. I think it's Moab, yes. Right. Question was, somebody asked the question, where is that picture? I'm not exactly sure where it is. I thought it was maybe in LA, but and it almost doesn't matter, because this is how many of our urban areas are developing. So I think we got to thinking a little bit more now. All right, too many people trying to go to those same few places where we get all of those things that we need. The idea was now maybe it's time to start bringing some of those services and those goods back closer to where people live, so that they don't have to travel in conditions quite like this, and make it a little bit more convenient then. So that's great. So we started seeing the development of some facilities and centers closer to people, but we had all those cars, right? So as we started making those facilities, we built them in such a way that we could get to them easily by car. We had those cars, right? We've got to use them. Man, they're great. Just jump in a car quick. You can go wherever you want to go. Well, so as we started developing these new facilities and these centers closer out to where people were, we started doing some different things. We started separating the uses. Offices over here, the stores over there, maybe the community center over there. And, it didn't matter, right? Because we could quickly get between them with the cars. But when you do that, and everybody's taking a car to get to the things that they need and want to do, we got to find some place to put those cars when people get there. And so the big dominant character of our urban landscape started to become storage of cars, parking lots, and facilities that are meant for cars. It kind of made it more convenient, a little bit easier with cars, but once again, we continued to grow, and it just got harder and harder because we have more and more cars to deal with and more ways to get. And you know what? You build those facilities for cars, makes such a great urban environment, right? Such a pleasant place to be. Those town centers that were created, you have the stores over here, the offices over there, the library somewhere else, and we drive to all of them, and every one of them has their own parking lot, and every one of them is maybe not that great a place because it's built for cars. It's not built for people. So just way too many cars. We've got to think of something else to do. So maybe what we thought was, let's get people on transit. We can get people out of their cars into transit and go to those places that they need to go. But part of the problem is now we had those places smeared all over the landscape. They weren't necessarily concentrated in centers. And so it makes it difficult for transit to serve all of those places that are so separated and so spread out. And not only that, because it is that way and they were designed for cars, it's really hard to get people out of their cars because transit's not that convenient at that point. And it's still just easier to jump in your car. And so even the people that are using transit, they're going to get stuck in traffic just like those that are still using their cars, and you maybe don't have any real advantage in doing things in that way. So, folks, maybe what we need to do now is we need to work maybe on the demand side more rather than the supply side. Instead of giving people more and more ways to get to where all of these different places they want to go, maybe we need to do something about the places where they're going to go or where they want to go and do something a little bit different with that. Actually, maybe what we want to do is we want to go back to the past and look at the way our communities were developed in the past and how we provided those services and facilities back in those days. Recreate those small towns, the places where you had all of the services, all of the goods, all of the things in one place, and it was easy to walk amongst them and get those things. Well, we're seeing some of that. We're seeing things happen in the development in our urban regions, in our particular our metropolitan regions. Places that are called centers, urban centers, town centers. You kind of hear that term now as these new developments come up. And it's true that we are starting to see some concentrations of things, but it's primarily commercial. When you look at what we're getting with these new centers that are being developed, it's primarily the commercial uses that are being concentrated in those centers. And maybe, and to some extent, a few office jobs and things like that. In order to be a real center, it's going to take some effort on the part of both the private sector, those developers and investors and property owners that are interested in doing these things, and the public sector in investing in some facilities and services and things that really, truly will make these things be more of a true urban center character. And really, in a lot of ways, it's going back to the future, going back to the past or bringing the past back to the future in the way we design those facilities, but they don't happen on their own. They need some help. They need some collaboration on the part of those that develop and those that will provide the services and plan and do our community. So let's look at some of the different characteristics of those urban centers and what we need to do to make them more true centers and maybe function more in the way that will help the character of our metropolitan, our urban regions as we grow and develop in the future. The first principle is mixed use. And as I mentioned, we're seeing that a little bit more, but we really need to get into that idea a little bit more and a broad range of uses, and we'll talk about the kinds of things maybe to locate in there. Another thing to keep in mind about the commercial part of it, the character of our commercial development is changing. And we heard about that after this last Christmas season. We'd already actually been hearing about it already before that, but it really kind of got driven home a little bit more in this last Christmas season. Because what did we hear? How many people did their Christmas shopping online? Or at least a good part of your Christmas shopping online? And how many of you are doing more and more of your shopping online? It affects a lot of things, and we just recently heard about a deal that the state of Utah struck with Amazon, for example, to collect sales tax. Well, that's because our sales tax from, we have a growing population base. People are buying more stuff than ever, but we're not keeping up on sales tax because people are buying more and more of this stuff online. It's going to affect our regional centers as well, our urban centers. The character, first of all, the amount of the commercial that's located in those centers and the character of it is likely going to change. We're going to have less of it, less of the brick and mortar stores probably that you see. But the kind of commercial activities that we will see in centers are probably now going to be more predominantly the kinds of things you cannot get online. How many of you want to go buy a burrito online, right? Or get a haircut online? Or other things like that. So some of these things, and entertainment, you can get, you can downstream the videos and the movies, but if you want to see live theater or want to see a concert, you got to go someplace. And these centers may be the place where you do that. And so it's really all about mixing up the uses and getting a big variety and changing the character of what those centers really are. So another big component of that, or something that should be a bigger component of our centers, is we should have residential in there as well. And we are seeing that. We're beginning to see that in some of the centers that are developing around the region. But it's generally going to be higher density, which immediately raises a red flag in a lot of communities. But think of it in the context of creating an urban center. And that higher density will be closer, or will be right near that center. We have people that, it may not be you, may not be your neighbor, but there are people, believe me, they're out there, they like living close to the action. They want to live close to that center. And they don't necessarily want to take care of a yard. And so a little bit higher density, maybe a lot higher density, and put it in those centers. It provides a place for the people that want to live that way to have a place to live, and it helps those centers. It gives that center some activity 24 hours a day because you've got people living there and that are close to that center and doing things. So don't overlook the residential component of those centers. Now, some of the other things that we should be looking for in creating really good urban centers. One of those things is a place for people to gather. That's what really makes them cool. A place where people can go and just, sit down, take their latte or take their orange juice or whatever, their bagel that they bought, and sit down and watch people go by and sit and talk to people, and just a place to hang out. Bring their dog and let their dog run around a little bit. And those places where people hang out can also become community gathering places where you hold events and celebrations, the 4th of July, the Christmas tree lighting ceremony, peach days, whatever you're going to do. And man, people come down to those centers and makes that center a much more viable, a much more energetic, a place where a lot is happening, and a place where people, when you don't have events happening, someplace they can just go hang out. Sometimes you want to just get out, right? You don't necessarily want to read your book or watch the video sitting in your house. Go outside and get outside for a while. And that allows for some of that to happen. Another thing that we want to look at creating in centers, and this is on the public sector side, start putting your public services and facilities in your urban centers. The library, the senior citizen center, the recreation center, any number of things that you might be doing. The regional theater that you may be supporting and investing in. Put those things in the urban centers because, one, it helps make it a much more viable place, a much more active place where things are going on, and it gives people another reason to go there and really starts to help getting that critical mass there. So instead of taking your new theater or your new library that you're going to build and putting it out on some greenfield site far away from anything else, because the land's cheaper, right? You want to spend less. You want to be frugal with the public dollars, but what are you really creating at that point? Maybe you're not really helping to create the community, a place where people can gather and can do things. Maybe spend a little bit more, but put it in that urban center, and man, It'll really help. It'll help the urban center, and it may help as well getting people to those services. All right, and design your centers to be walkable. Make it a friendly place for people to walk, to be, to hang out in. Don't design it for cars. Make it someplace that people like to be and like to walk around in. And then it makes it easy. You've got all those mixed uses. You've got the stores. You've got the offices where you may be working, or some people may be working. You've got those public facilities. And you can get from place to place to place without having to get in that car and drive between them, and have all those different places where you need to store cars, and makes for a much more pleasant place to be. We will then start getting, I think, to something that's a little bit more reminiscent of those old towns, those old centers we talked about, that I talked about at the beginning of the presentation here. And then so we're getting back to the future. And it helps us to do all of those things. Now, it's not easy to do these things. And let me just say that because you've got usually multiple property owners, multiple developers, and the public sector that all need to be coordinated and brought together. And there's probably, and I'm guessing in the future, we'll have some more detailed discussions about how to help make that happen. It's not an easy thing to do necessarily. It becomes relatively easy when you have one large property owner that can create their own center. And that is happening in some instances, here and around the country. But generally, for a lot of our communities, we're talking about trying to get these kinds of urban centers developed in places where you got to do a lot of coordination, a lot of thought ahead of time about how you want it to develop, where you want it to develop, and how do you make that happen. And that coordination issue is a little bit difficult. But the rewards are great if we can get there, because we can create the type of environment that I think people want to be. One other thing to remember in creating these centers is make them so that they're connected by transit. They're easily accessible by transit, and the centers themselves are connected by transit. One reason is that people then, if you're going to try to create an environment where people can walk and you're not really trying to cater to a car, it makes sense to then also make it so that people can get there without bringing their car if they want to. Because once they're there, they don't need their car. They can walk around and they can get to all of the places they need to be without their car. So make it easy for them to get there by some ways other than transit as well, or by other than car as well, transit. And then it really makes some sense for transit to be effective to connect our centers, the different centers, with transit, especially as you go up the hierarchy. So somebody who may be in their neighborhood urban area, their neighborhood urban center, and now they say, let's say, well, I got to go to downtown Salt Lake, or I got to go over here to the main part of Sandy, or wherever your bigger center is. And you know what? I can go and get in my car and battle all of that traffic to get there, or I can just go to my little local center and hop on transit from there and get to the other center. And drives down the demand that we may need for vehicles and all of the facilities that we need to create for that. So design them so that they're easily accessible and easily usable by transit. Now, just a couple of quick words about parking, about our urban centers and parking. Parking is one of those bugaboos that you just have to deal with whenever we're talking about almost any kind of future urban development or regional or just any kind of development as we grow. And as much as we'd like to think that we can get people, we're designing these centers, we're making them so it's a place where people don't have to have cars to be there. But the reality is, at least for us, that most people are probably still going to have to get there or will get there by car. So we've got to deal with the car in these urban centers. And it's just one of those facts of life, and so there's a couple of things to think about. First of all, businesses themselves have standards for parking that are way too high. There are a lot of businesses are generally, especially retail businesses, are looking for creating enough parking for that busiest day of the Christmas season, right? They want to have enough parking for all of that. And most of the rest of the year, a lot of it goes unused. And so you really look at that. And then if you multiply that by each business doing that same thing, that means a lot of unused space sitting around creating those environments that we talked about a little bit earlier. Built for the car, it's not built for people. Those standards are way too high. Generally, they don't need that much parking. And our local community standards are oftentimes based on these business standards, the requirements that we have in our local zoning codes. And so there are codes out there that are much reduced in the amount of parking that's required. And take a look. Go find those, learn a little bit about them, and look at a way to reduce that requirement and that need for parking in those facilities. In our well-designed centers, if we have these centers so that they're well-designed, people are going to come there because they want to walk. And a lot of them will come by ways other than cars. They'll come by transit, they'll come by bicycle. If they're close enough, they may even just walk to the place. And so that reduces the need for parking as well. So think about that. Think about the amount of parking that we're requiring or putting into these centers. Now, we do have to deal with some parking. And the best possible way to deal with it is put it underground. So it's out of sight, out of the way. Works great. Yeah, good idea. Expensive as all heck, right? Just probably can't afford it, given the value of what we're building up above. If it's possible, if the economics work out, if you can even provide some public incentives or public financing to do that, that's the best way to do it. Get it underground, get it out of sight, get it out of mind. You know, you go to some of the places in downtown Salt Lake, some of the other areas where we have some underground parking, it's just great because it's just doesn't even affect the environment above, hardly at all. But in reality, we're probably not going to be able to do that in many of our centers. And so another way to look at it then is maybe structures. Again, that's still pretty expensive, not as expensive as underground, but relatively expensive. But if you're going to do structures, make sure that they're well designed and well integrated into the urban center. But that even may be beyond the reach of what we're able to do. And so in that case, if we're looking at surface parking, put your parking on the periphery of the center. Put it out around the edges. In the center, you may have some on-street parking. And that works relatively well for the short term, those folks that are in and out really quick, and you know, you design it in such a way that it's not a big issue or problem. But by and large, otherwise, to accommodate the number of people that you're anticipating, try to locate that parking out on the periphery so that the center itself is not all designed and taken up by cars. All right. That's where we're at. I'm done with my part of this presentation, giving you a little bit of a background and some initial things to think about. And I think our next speaker is Patrick Risk, who looks really sharp. He woke up this way. Thank you. And let's see, I got to give you.
Other sides, while we're waiting, make sure all of your microphones are turned off. So we're getting some feedback from you guys.
Okay.
Great.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. All right. Is the green light on this? Yes. Can everybody hear me? Wave your hands in the air like you just don't care. Yeah. Okay, perfect. All right, so jokes on Wilf, actually. This is actually my pajamas. So, well, but no, so I want to kind of talk about building off of what Wilf talked about, which is great. It's talking about the centers of, and he kind of posed the question of how do we accomplish this? This is kind of one option that I want to talk about. But first, I kind of want to talk about community life cycles. Or even a neighborhood life cycle. What we often see is, depending on the housing stock that's been built, you have young families move in. Then so the family size might be 3.5 to 4 in family size. I don't know how you do the 0.5 child, but works out. And then after a number of years, however long that space of time might be, kids move out. And then you just have mom and dad at home. And so the neighborhood kind of declines in some ways, demographics change. And then over time, it might redevelop. We're seeing some of that in Holiday, where pocket developments might come in. Ivory Homes, some developers come and do pocket developments. Or just young families move back to an area. And so, you know, you have the growing areas where there's lots of land, there's lots of growth. You have the aging areas where it's been built out, and until it redevelops or new young families move in. And then you have some of the redevelopment where pocket developments might come in, where there was large lot sizes or a large farm still there for some reason, a landowner. And so if we think about the growth of a community, the natural growth of a community looks something like this, like a half bell curve kind of. Again, you have kind of the period of growth. And then when we're considering the saturation point, at least as it relates to, which my expertise in it, as it relates to churches and schools, if you consider what is that saturation point, that's obviously the point where you have the largest family size. And you have the largest family size and the most population. And then, so as we consider that saturation point and we consider a strategic point of planning, it's important to consider that, because what is the future of this neighborhood going to look like? And therefore, what are the land uses now that are serving maybe a younger population? And what do the land uses need to be in the future, maybe servicing an aging or older population? And so during a period of saturation, you have to consider, you know, what does that mean in terms of we have the young family sizes, then you're going to have a period of underutilization as it relates to building use. If you build, just think of a school, for instance. Often you build schools, and as soon as they're finished in these areas of growth, they have portables on the back and add more and more portables. And then over time, they start removing the portables. And maybe even over a longer period of time, we've seen what's happened to, I just forgot, what's the high school there? Granite High School. You know, sell off the school altogether. And what are they going to do with that land now? So some important discussion points as related to that is, one, how can we maybe flatten that bell curve? And we'll talk a little bit about that. So kind of the swing in community life cycles. And two, how do we plan land use and buildings to fluctuate with community life cycles over time? So, you know, servicing a young population versus buildings serving an aging population. So in one scenario, if I told you there was a neighborhood that had residential, single family, townhomes, apartments, senior living, it also had education places, high school, middle school, elementary, charter schools. It had religious spaces, civic spaces, shops, and offices. That sounds like a pretty great community. Wow, they got everything. They got the mix. They got the works. Here's one. It's got all that, actually. Besides, actually, it doesn't have very many, it doesn't have a lot of apartments here, not very many office spaces, and a few senior living, like right here. But the thing that it does, the issues that it does have is there are 36, these X's across the map, are 36 dead-end streets. So they end in a cul-de-sac or they don't connect to something. The high school right there has 430 parking spaces that surround the high school, and also a fence line about a half mile long that kind of shuts out the neighborhood, if you will. Then you have an elementary school here. It's got 62 parking spaces, about a third of a mile perimeter fence. You got a middle school, 200 parking spaces, a half a mile fence. You have 3 different churches. Combined, they have 661 parking stalls, half a mile fence. You do have a post office. It's kind of hidden away among some townhomes. And then you have some shops over here that have 600 or 716 parking stalls and about almost a mile of kind of doesn't really interact well with its surroundings, a border wall kind of. And so, again, they have all the things to make it successful, but was it laid out correct? Was it laid out in such a way that it truly was an interconnected community it provided that mix. It provided that facilitation of a quality community. So this one, maybe a little bit better, still some opportunities for improvement. But one thing this does have, it doesn't have any civic space, shops, or offices, which I'll talk about in a minute. But it does only have 7 dead-end streets instead of the 30 that we were talking about. And what it does have, because which I'll talk about in a minute, of a different approach to planning where you get stakeholders involved early on in the process to talk about creating spaces, centers. It does have, at least from my perspective, I think it's a beautiful thing. It has this center street here, which is appropriately called Church Street. The church on this end and a church on that end. It creates a center. It creates a visual down the street, a destination, something I'm walking towards, rather than just an endless street with maybe a parking lot. And that makes me want to walk down there for sure. But some things that could improve in this, and I'll talk about how it could improve, is you have a school here, but you have church parking here, and I'm assuming they'll have a lot of school parking here. Is there an opportunity to talk about that? Is there shared use agreements? Is there something that could maybe be done to utilize the land a little bit better? Then you also, you have a space here. I would say they should talk about a civic space. You know, can you put a rec center here? Can you put a library? Can you put something here? And then here, could you put a little main street there, some shops, maybe some offices? And again, it kind of something that looked more like that, but also facilitated the neighborhood feel that they want. It's kind of an all the above board of options. So what we have right now.
Sure.
Uh-huh.
Why are cul-de-sacs bad? People seem to like being on a street that people don't drive down.
Yes, but people, yeah, I think she'll talk about it next. Sorry. Okay. So be prepared. So the difference in these 2 neighborhoods and how it could even improve even more, because that last neighborhood, the improvements that were made, having the church street where you at least have a center point of focus and some of those elements, it's because actually the developer and the city contacted me early on as a church and said, we're building this neighborhood. How many churches would you need to support a neighborhood like this in terms of the households that they were building? I said, oh, probably 2. Then we worked together and say, let's lay it out in this way that will facilitate a better community. We got all the stakeholders involved. How that could have improved is maybe getting more stakeholders involved. Something amazing happens when you get all the stakeholders at the table together. And so right now we have individual planning efforts happening. The city's doing their thing, we have the developers doing their thing, school districts, churches, and others. What if we did a more coordinated approach? We said, okay, let's get on the same page. What are our objectives here? And let's start talking about your interest here, my interest here, where we overlap and where we can having some of those dialogues and conversations that will improve the community, not only immediately, but over the long term as well as we look at that growth cycle of a community. I think we're having questions at the end, sorry, but thank you. So what I'll just mention real quick, what I would propose in that regard is, you know, in order to achieve that more coordinated planning approach, I would say that the stakeholders should be meeting at least once a year to talk about what's going on in the city, in their plans as developers for proposed developments, and the plans for schools and what schools are looking at, and the plans for church and community and civic spaces and what's needed there. Meeting at least once a year to talk about what's going on in the upcoming year. I would also That obviously will lead to conversations about how can you further coordinate and collaborate on specific projects, on specific details as it relates to land uses and land plans, parking agreements, leasing, various things in terms of how are we building a community along the objectives that we've discussed. And then also sharing pertinent data and information. I have a mantra that if you know what I know and I know what you know, we usually come to the same conclusion. We're all reasonable people wanting to accomplish the objectives that we have in front of us. And usually those objectives are very similar. We just come at it at different angles because our data says different things. And if I knew what your data said and you knew what my data said, then we probably would be able to come to a more conclusive agreement. And so in just conclusion on my part, really the whole objective of this is really to, like I said, get all the stakeholders at the table and start having those conversations. And why is because the objective is to build quality communities that have that mix of individuals that allow for the preservation of choice and also that opportunity for multi-generational living so preservation of choice means that if I want to live in an apartment or if I want to live in a single family home, but I want to live in this community, I should have that choice. I shouldn't have to live, if I want to live in in a more urban environment, I have to live in downtown Salt Lake, and I don't really want to live in downtown Salt Lake. If I want to live in a more single family area, I have to live in Eagle Mountain. I don't really want to live in Eagle Mountain. Preserving that choice within a community allows individuals to choose where they want to live and also allows for that multi-generational housing. So a family can move into a starter home, then the kids grow up, the kids actually move to an apartment that is actually in the same neighborhood. Parents downsize to a more 55-plus community that's in the same neighborhood. Then the kids get married, the kids move into
Sorry to interrupt. Sorry to interrupt. Someone has their microphone open and we can't hear you over here in Richfield too well.
Push your A button is what we've been told. So it's all about preserving choice and providing that opportunity so families can live together in the same neighborhood, that we can have that well mixed, that we don't have these swings in community life cycles where we have to continually go into a neighborhood, rip down housing, rip down stores, and redevelop it because now demographics have changed. But we plan ahead a little bit and look at things with a little more foresight by getting all the stakeholders together and doing that collaboratively. So that's my portion. So perfect. Thanks.
Thank you, Patrick. The green button. The green button. Okay. I look up to Wilf. He's a little bit taller than I am, and I'm 6'5", so, but he's one of the greatest planners that we have in the state. And appreciate Patrick. We've been working with him in Santaquin City because we're one of the fastest growing communities in Utah County, which is one of the fastest growing counties in the nation. And I started working for Santaquin about 11 years ago. And we have all the beautiful orchards on the south end of Utah County. And the city council and the residents said we want to keep those orchards as much as we can, which caused us to have to look at, well, how do we keep the orchards but still have all the growth that's going to be coming in? And I've been tasked specifically with presenting to you some of the fiscal aspects of growth. And how do you still facilitate growth with the fiscal aspects in mind with the limited amount of ground that you have? And for some cities along the Wasatch Front, you might already be built out to your edge. How do you take advantage of what's available And Ari told me specifically to put some emphasis on the rural aspect because I know many small communities, you're not necessarily facing some of the growth issues, but you do have an opportunity to look at how you want to grow now so that you can be fiscally sustainable long term. So with that in mind, why do cities want to grow? Well, it's the money, right? Everybody wants to have more money. At least that's the perception from the residents, right? That's the only reason why you're letting more houses get built is so you can get the money from it. Well, yeah, but there's ways of bringing in retail that a lot of cities try to do. They try to grab the next store down the street. They have to provide parks because the residents say, I want a park, I want a playground set in my park. So that takes money. Obviously, there's services that have to be provided. We went back and we found the very first ordinance that Santaquin ever adopted, and it was a dog ordinance. Well, I think we finally got an animal control officer about 5 years ago. So anyways, you know, we have to provide those things. And sometimes, especially in small towns, we don't look at growth as growth. You know, Bob, my neighbor, wants to subdivide a piece of ground for his kid or his multiple kids or whatever. But it brings impacts. And really, as the growth pattern that's been occurring traditionally since the automobile came into play has caused it to where cities have to grow to be able to afford what's being built. They have to get a revenue stream to come in. And in Utah, particularly, property tax is a bad word. And so how else do we pay for these things? Let me just give you an example of Santaquin. This is from our last budget. We've estimated that it's about $3 a linear foot to maintain our sewer system. That's every year our city council has to budget that much. And we have almost 53 miles of sewer line. Now, that's just coming from a community that right now is only 12,000 people. If you can imagine Salt Lake City, who still even has wood pipes in the ground dealing with some other issues, okay? And you can see the rest. Culinary lines, $1.25 a linear foot with 100 miles. As you go through, you break it down to not just what is the city's cost, but what is the actual household cost. If you looked at the city's budget and what is the actual impact to you as a household, what is that impact to you? And then you have the traditional, well, the guy my kids love, Bob the Builder. Can we fix it? Well, if we have the money, right? Now, the other issue is this is just the cost to maintain it. At some point, those pipes deteriorate to where they have to be replaced. And the life cycle for a lot of these pipes, at least with the new PVC type of pipes, it might be 100 years, but your old concrete pipe doesn't last that long. Even some of the old PVC pipe that was made doesn't last that long. Eventually, cities have to find a revenue source to pay for the replacement of every piece of pipe that goes in the ground. And your roads, if you don't do anything to them, they have an asphalt life cycle of about 7 years. And then you have to start doing something to it to maintain your roads. Now, my wife, she grew up in Sanpete County in a little town called Fayette. Beautiful town, still only has about 200 people in it. About 8 years ago, they came on to a funding source to where they could pave about a quarter mile of road. And they did. Well, this last year, after not having maintained any piece of that road, they ripped up all the asphalt and they relayed road base and they put a chip seal down. Because for asphalt,
somebody has their mic on.
For a small community of 200 people, they don't have a revenue stream to pay for asphalted roads. Now, generally, they do maintain the roads that they have, but it's something to be mindful of, especially in small towns. Can we afford this infrastructure if we put it in? So then you get Bob saying, I don't know if it's going to happen. Am I speaking into another mic? So let's just look at basic tax theory.
It's not you, it's one of these.
You've probably heard the term broaden the base, lower the rate. Okay? If you get enough revenue sources around, it reduces the impact to any one source. Some of you may be familiar with this exercise. Well, if more people can be brought in to support the log, it's a less painful experience. But the question, I guess, is how do you add more people to the log without increasing the size of the log? Okay. I highly recommend, if you want to look at the fiscal aspect of development, go to this, go onto YouTube and search for this Joseph Ninakosi Urban 3 presentation. It was given in Ogden just back in December. It's about an hour long. It is fairly entertaining.
You are the only participant.
But I'm going to show one clip here. This is about a 4-minute clip. And then we'll jump back into kind of a case study in Santaquin. Oh, that didn't work.
We need to step out and understand what cities really are. I love this. This is straight out of Oxford Dictionary. Incorporate, to constitute a company or a city or other organization as a legal corporation. So y'all have a charter to manage a corporation. You are incorporated. You have a finite boundary of land, and for council, y'all are the board of directors for managing this multi-billion-dollar corporation, right? So my state, incidentally, made it illegal for my city to annex land. So what we have is a finite boundary of land. That's all we have is a certain number of acres, and we have to manage those acres. So my city is worth $12.8 billion in taxable value. So as a corporation, my mayor is 6 times the value of Ted Turner, or about 13 times the value of your billionaire. You know, this is the governor's father, right? So if this is how we look at land, if this is, or businesses, if this is how we measure something like this, shouldn't we be doing the same thing for our city? Shouldn't we be looking at land as a product? Land is what you manage. Land is all that you have. It's your corporate boundary. Shouldn't you look at it like a farmer? So when farmers look at real estate, what farmers do is they're making an economic model of how that operates. They don't just go out and till all of the soil. They're running what's going on in the marketplace. What do soybeans make per acre in the marketplace? What do they produce? So if we look at buildings the same way, what would the numbers look like? So this is one of our buildings. This is the streetscape project that Chris got irritated about, by the way. So we got a garbage can, a bike rack, 2 benches, and a street tree. Thank you, city, for that $30,000 at our front door. That's our subsidy, right? That was your gift to us and our property. We took this from an empty building to retail, office, and then residential on the upper 4 stories. The taxable value of that building went from $300,000 to $11 million. That's the taxable value. So what happened on the taxes on that property is they shot up 3,500%. That's not money that we get. That's money that the community gets. That's taxes they get just grew by 3,500%. So do you all have a 401k plan that grows by 3,500%? Wouldn't you like that? So people say, well, Joe, that's not fair. That's an $11 million building. You have this Walmart over here at $20 million. All right, fair enough. That Walmart pays $220,000 in property taxes. This is my house. Those are my dogs. My dogs are a little weird, by the way. They think they're lions. We're on 1/10 of an acre. We pay $2,000 in taxes. So if a 1-acre cookie cutter fell from space and hit my neighborhood, it'd grab 10 houses, right? Each paying $2,000, or about $20,000 an acre in taxes. Y'all follow me? Yep, gotcha. So let's lift that 1-acre cookie cutter up, fly it in space, drop it on that Walmart, divide its $220,000 by 34 acres, and on a per acre basis, this is what you get out of that Walmart. And if you had an acre of our building downtown, this is what you get. So if you could grow a crop, what kind of crop yield would you want to have? I was presenting this in Colorado. I was like, let me make it easy for you people in Colorado. If you're going to grow something, what are you going to grow? And they got it. Cash crops, right? We understand that. We understand the economics of that. Just apply that to buildings. Now, in Colorado's case, they actually run their cities off pretty much monolithically off retail taxes. So they're like, look, we take the losses in property taxes for the retail. Let's run the numbers again. You know, Walmart, a typical Walmart sells $70 million, $77 million worth of stuff. But the city gets a portion of that. So we get 27% of that 8-cent sales tax on that 77 million. So we don't get 77 million. We get a piece back, which is still significant. It's about 47,500 an acre. Add that to the 3,300 we're getting at the city level in taxes. So the city's total take per acre is 51,000 for total taxes out of that Walmart. That's just our property taxes per acre. Now we sell stuff. We have retail on the ground floor. Let's add our retail taxes. Now you're cooking with gas. Jobs per acre. I mean, it's kind of stunning when you just make things apples to apples. The truth is in the data. The numbers speak for themselves. We even have 90 units of residential per acre versus their 0. You just get more stuff in less space. And there's a reason why we've been building cities for tens of thousands of years this way. This goes all the way back to Damascus. This is how we make efficient places for us.
I think that last line, this is how we make efficient places for us, is kind of the takeaway. Now, we recognize that there is a different market depending on where you're at in the state. But can you start to plan now? Do your zoning codes prohibit increased density potential? Can they be modified to still meet the market demand in such a way that some of this can be a reality for you? So let me just show you. Well, I'll hurry and go through this one. If you start looking at your city as a corporation, how can you maximize your revenue potential if you didn't add another road or annex more ground? Causes you to have to rethink, right? How do I start inside, which gets to this term of infill that I'll talk about briefly. And oftentimes the residents, or the fear is, the residents won't want that kind of growth. Well, ask the question, what development characteristics might they consider appropriate? And then these last two, which we won't have time to get into today, what are the market conditions in your area? And other than new development, what can be done to reduce your expenditures? Oftentimes we're always thinking, how can we get more and more and more? But talk to your administrators, your directors, and say, how can we reduce our expenses? So we went to our core area of town. These are the residents that have been here the longest. These are the ones that have the most to lose if development comes in. And we asked them some questions. Okay? Why consider infill development? This is one block that we have in this core area of town. Their property taxes they pay, this was just last year, almost $17,000. And when they talk about the city getting a portion of a portion, well, we only get $2,500 off of what they pay in property taxes. So for those 10 homes, those 10 households, just to pay for the roads, the sewer line, the water line, the irrigation line, and the parks in the area, they would need to come up with about $11,000 a year for those 10 homes, okay? And then we said, how do we make up that difference? Most cities will have their user fees on their water systems to help pay for it, their sewer fees, and so on. But is there a way of, again, reducing that impact to residents? And how do we broaden the base? We said, how many of you can develop? How many of you could actually subdivide your property? When we went through this exercise, the zoning code at that time would only allow 3 more lots in that block because of the minimum lot size and the minimum frontage requirements. And we asked the question, well, what should we do to encourage development in this core area of town in an appropriate way? And most people said, well, just reduce the frontage of the lots, or maybe reduce the lot size minimums, okay? So we said, well, we already have an infill standard. We allow a 20% reduction. This is how many lots could get built on there if we did that. I won't read through all the text. And we said, well, what if we just made the infill standard the standard? You put 26 more, 26 homes on this one block instead. And then we said, well, what if there's another option? What if there was an appropriate way of designing additional development in this neighborhood, what could it look like? We have, if we just did our infill standard, if we focus on these brown areas, the potentially buildable ground in the city, with the 11,000 or 1,100 homes that we have there now, with infill, you could put another 319, actually closer to 350 homes as we went back and looked at it. What is 350 homes worth? Well, it saves us having to build another 5 miles of roads and chewing up 90 more acres of ground. Now, in a community where you're wanting to preserve the agricultural quality and character, the orchards, 90 acres, that's a lot of ground to try to save. Well, again, we said, if this is what we're doing now with our almost 2.5 units to the acre, if we made it look right, would 4 units to the acre be okay? What about 7 units to the acre? If it was designed appropriately and you had open spaces and things incorporated, what about 10 units to the acre? And so we asked the residents in this public meeting, with appropriate standards for landscaping, architectural, parking, so on, which of these types of housing would you allow to be built in this core area of town? We still had a third that said single family would still be their preference, but you now have a bunch of people saying, over half people saying, we would allow duplexes, we would allow townhomes to come into this area. And so if we did that, you then put 44 units in this one block instead of 10 that are there now. So you've basically increased the property values, the taxable value of this one block by almost 300%. The revenue to the city comes in by that same amount, and the cost per household, as far as their obligation to pay for these services, goes down by 70%. Now, from a city standpoint, our property tax value in Santaquin is about average for Utah County. So even if we just, every year the city has to go through a process and decide, do we want to increase our property tax? Well, do we want to increase the property tax, or do we want to let people find a way to utilize the vacant garden plot that grandma used to use that we don't even know how to work anymore? We asked the same question for the Main Street area. Can we increase the development potential here by, again, architectural standards, landscaping standards, parking, dress it up a little bit? And we asked the residents, right now the zoning code says that any new development on Main Street has to have a 2-story building. Is that okay? 40% said yes. Don't change it. Let's make development happen on Main Street. And then it's kind of funny. This was about a year ago. We went through this, and then in the last month, we had somebody say, I've got a piece of ground that only allows 1 story on it because of the development constraints. Can we rezone it so I'd only have to build 1 story? And the council said this week, no, we want to have 2 stories on Main Street. It takes a little bit. Does it really make a difference? What you're looking at here is a 3D map or an image of Santaquin's heart. It's not the entire city, but you have I-15 and Highway 6 that runs through it. This is the value per acre in Santaquin. The spikes on the right side, that's a brand new townhome development that's coming in. Ironically, it's in a green field. It's where the ground was cheap. It's where the developer said, can I do this? And we said, yeah, we want to start limiting our push out into the orchard, so we're going to start allowing some density in these places.
Professor, we can't see your presentation anymore. Are the other sites seeing it?
Nope.
Also have on Main Street, we allow for, and we have a 3-story mixed-use building that was constructed, and we have 2 more that are ready for a building permit on our Main Street. So it does help. It's a matter of how can we utilize those spaces, and certainly as you're going out to residents into them, you're just going to plop this Army barracks type of building down in my backyard. I don't want that. So a lot of times it's a discussion of, well, what would you allow? So.
Can you guys see the presentation now?
Yes, we can. Thanks.
So real quickly, going back to the discussions earlier of all the parking and all the roads and the cul-de-sacs and everything, a lot of it comes down to who's paying for it. You know, one way to think of cul-de-sac is you're basically creating an extra long driveway for 6 homes. Are they willing to pay for that extra long driveway? Something to think about, in addition to the connectivity aspect of it. So with that, I'll turn the time over to our next presenter.
Sorry, I could still do left and right hands. Oh, on this? Oh, yeah, okay. And then, can I just put this in my pocket or something? Okay, I guess this is the point where I ask if everyone in the audience out there can hear what I'm saying. You're supposed to wave if you can. Can you guys hear what I'm saying? Okay, yeah. Okay, perfect. Okay, so today I'm going to talk about how we can improve convenient access to jobs, services, and housing. In the transportation field, we typically refer to this as access to opportunity. So how many destinations can people get to in a short amount of time? And this can either be how many jobs and services a household can get to, or this can be how many households a job or a service can access. And I want to bring this up because this measure can help us link land use, transportation, and economic development together, which is sort of what everyone's been talking about here. And it's one of the biggest indicators for social mobility. So more so than test scores or dual parent households or anything like that, access to our jobs and education system are one of the factors of how well our communities are doing economically. It's also important for trying to get businesses into an area. So businesses want to be located where they have access to an educated workforce. So if you want your communities to succeed, access is very important. So it's not just me saying that, it's also what Utahns want. So Envision Utah did this survey asking people how they can make their communities better. And the top 3 responses were how people could get around more conveniently without a car, how we can limit congestion, and how they wanted to make services and amenities closer to where people live. So all of these things are improved with better access. Another important thing in the access is providing transportation choices. So this was a survey, statewide household travel survey that was done a few years ago, and people overwhelmingly said they wanted more choices in how they can get around. So you can see more people wanted to walk, bike, and take transit more often. So how, oh, sorry, that's what I wanted to say. Okay, so how can we do that? We can do that both through a land use and a transportation lens. We can't solve access just from a land use side, and we can't solve it just from a transportation side. The two things have to work together. And so 3 of the main ways we can do that is by mixing our land uses, which you've already heard a lot about. But we can also improve our street connectivity, making things closer together. And then we can also provide complete streets, which provides safer access so people have the ability now to walk and bike if they so choose. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time on the mix of uses because we've been talking a lot about that. But I just want to reiterate the point. Does this have a pointer? Oh, okay. So in this situation, we can see that all of the land uses are separated. They're all surrounded by parking. And so if this was our walk buffer, if you parked at that retail location, you wouldn't really be able to get anywhere else besides getting back in your car and driving around. In this situation where we have a mix of land uses on a connected network, wherever you are in this walk buffer, you can actually walk to somewhere else, you can bike somewhere else, you just can park once and get to a lot more destinations in a shorter period of time. So on the access front, this helps serve our needs a lot better than this in terms of providing our access to jobs, services, housing, and providing better economic opportunities. But this only works if we have connected street network. And so here's a quick, well, it's not that quick, definition of what connectivity is, but I want you to mainly focus on the multiple routes and a dense system of cross connections. So what does that mean? So here are two examples of a disconnected network and a connected network. So on the right, we see an area that's not very well connected. This house really only has one way of getting to the shopping center. So if anything were to happen along that route, they no longer have access to goods and services. In this case, which is a lot more connected, we see that House A actually has about four or more options to get to the shopping center. So if either one of these routes, there was an accident, there was a pipe was leaking, anything like that, this house can still have access to the shopping center and can still have access to goods and services. So this provides more options for the route choice. Another way connectivity benefits our cities, so in this, there's both a star sort of in the middle. This is a 1 mile travel shed. I know it says bike, but it can also be walk or transit or driving, however you want to get there. And in this situation where it's a lot more connected, you can see how much greater land use this person can get to. So that's all that much more destinations, that many more jobs, that many more houses that that person can get to within 1 mile. In this case, where it's less connected, you can see how reduced that land area is. So that's that many less jobs that person can get to, that many less services. So that impacts sort of the household income, but it also impacts our cities. What Dennis was saying earlier, I mean, it's going to drive down your ability to get retail tax or sales tax, anything like that. This also costs a lot more. I know it looks like it doesn't because there's not as many streets, but it does. So this provides more destinations. So I don't know if you guys know Ted Knowlton. He's the president of APA and the deputy director of the Wasatch Front Regional Council. But he likes to show this graphic when talking about street connectivity. And he'll ask the question, what's the oldest thing in this photo? Okay. Yeah, so Coliseum, I thought someone would say the river, but the Coliseum is what a lot of people might say, but actually it's the street network. And so once we build a street network, that's what we're building the rest of our built environment off of. So once that happens, it's almost impossible to go back and retrofit that to a connected network. So it's really essential that when we build our street network the first time, we get it right. And so again, I just want to hit on that this isn't a bunch of planners getting around and telling you that this is what you should be doing. This is also what the public is saying they want. So going back to that statewide travel survey, one of the questions was the top transportation priority should be connecting the streets and sidewalks for shorter distance trips. And I break this out in terms of Wasatch Front, which is the urbanized area between Salt Lake County and up to Brigham City, MAG, which is the urbanized area in Utah County and the state, just to prove the point that this isn't something that only people in urban areas want. This is something that is wanted throughout the state. So in this case, you can see that the overwhelmingly majority of the people agree or strongly agree that we need greater connectivity. And less than 10% disagree with that statement. And that's true no matter where you are in the state. Connectivity is also essential to our health. So right now we have a childhood obesity epidemic on our hands. And one of the reasons why is that we have less people walking and biking to school. We have less children being active. This was research done in 2011 that compared how many students were walking in Daybreak, which is pretty well connected, to similar neighborhoods that were less walkable. And you can see just how many more people walk in Daybreak than walk in other areas. So this just proves that connectivity is essential also to our health. I know that I feel like, well, so connectivity is really important for a lot of things. And these are 5 more reasons. So it improves our mobility. This is interesting. This came out of a study we just recently did within the Wasatch Front and the MAG area, that if you increase connectivity by 1%, that was essentially the same as adding 1 more lane mile of road. So we can make our networks more efficient by increasing connectivity. There's lower risks of fatal or severe crashes. The more intersection density we have, that's due to people going slower, for instance. There's a safety element. And this one is what a lot of people might be interested in, the economic perspective. So compact, connected neighborhoods can command a price premium of 40 to 100% more than their less connected neighborhoods. But touching on what Dennis said, I want to just mention about this emergency service. So these are 2 fire stations, and this is in Charlotte, North Carolina. Both of these fire stations are shown with a 2.5-mile street network response area. And you can see in the more connected network, which is the one on the right, how much larger that service area is. So as our cities are becoming more fiscally constrained, we can have more efficient government services the more connected we are. This includes fire departments, snow plowing, garbage collection. So how can we improve connectivity? There are 4 main ways of doing this. I'll just start with the metrics. So the metrics are, and it's not important that you know exactly what these metrics are, but just that the idea is that you're getting data on how your current city is doing, so that when you go to implement solutions, we know how well those solutions are working. By being able to measure connectivity, we can also find areas in the city where we should be focusing our improvements. And this needs to be backed up with plans and policies. So the plans and policies lay the foundation of improving connectivity into the future, so that when developments come in, you have something to stand up and say, this is what we want for our community, and your development has to meet the standards that we've set forward in these plans. And you can do this through ordinances, for instance. So this is Lehigh's street connectivity ordinance, which lays out block length, cul-de-sac length, and a connectivity index. So all developments that come in, all residential developments, have to meet the standards laid out in this, including minimum street connectivity. And that's important when people come in with developments like this, which has this one connection out of the city. And so if anyone were to develop this area or this area, it would inherently be disconnected from this development. So with ordinances and plans, you can come back in and say, we actually want streets to stub out in all of these areas, and we want this cul-de-sac to connect through to provide better access. And you might get a developer that comes in and says, well, actually, that's going to reduce my buildable area. I'm going to lose money from this development. And in fact, by doing that, you don't necessarily lose any property, any developable property. So in this case, we had like 2 properties on this corner, and if you stub that street out, you still have the ability to put in 2 properties, right? So you don't necessarily reduce the development just because we're asking you to sub streets out or we're asking you to connect streets. But if you're going to do that, just make sure that the next time a development comes in, they're held to the same standard. So here's a situation where these streets were asked to be stubbed out, and then this development came in and it's disconnected, and it's going to be, I mean, probably not within anyone's lifetime in this room that would ever be reconnected, just because, right, these are single family homes, and there's really no way of connecting those. Yeah, this is from Pennsylvania. So luckily not in Utah. So how do we retrofit? So this is, I mean, one of the easiest ways is to find an area that's undeveloped. So this is down in Lehigh. You can see there's 2 streets that are not connected to each other. And Lehigh said, okay, well, before all of this land gets developed and we lose our opportunity to improve connectivity, let's just go ahead and pave this road. So now they've actually done that. It's a paved connection. So now all these people can access this road over here, and all these people can access whatever's going on in this section of Lehigh. Another opportunity for retrofitting is knowing when development is going to be occurring, so taking advantage of redevelopment in your community. This is in Sugar House and Salt Lake, and they knew that these 2 blocks were undergoing some redevelopment. So the RDA, the redevelopment agency in the city, created a circulation plan to guide improvements when this happens. And so they wanted to take better advantage of their signalized intersections on the street. I guess for those of you out there in the audience, the street that's on the far right of the picture, and they wanted to connect these signalized intersections over to this main road, Highland. So actually this is happening. This section of this block is getting redeveloped, and although it's not exactly what was laid out in the circulation plan, this street Elm that we originally had connecting, I say we because I worked on this, to up here will actually get realigned, and it will come down to the signalized intersection. So it is being implemented. The easier ways to retrofit are just by providing pedestrian access. So here we can provide mid-block crossings, or we can provide pedestrian cut-throughs between buildings. And okay, so to your point on cul-de-sacs, although I'm not answering why they're bad, I mean, I think one of the reasons they're bad, right, is because they limit connectivity. We've already seen the benefits of that. But you can actually take advantage of them in some ways. Most people aren't in favor of opening an existing cul-de-sacs up to vehicular access, but we've done surveys as part of a connectivity study we did. It's about 1,300 people responded throughout the state, and 73% of those people said that they would be open to opening cul-de-sacs for pedestrian and bike access. So you can see in this case, this sidewalk opens access to a regional trail, and this little sidewalk opens access to a sidewalk that's outside of the neighborhood. I presented on street connectivity a few days ago and got a question about people, cul-de-sacs command higher prices. And so if you open these pedestrian bicycle connections, does that impact the property values of those cul-de-sacs? And I want to mention this one because it's on a trail. So actually, the closer you are to a trail, you typically see higher prices. Before this existed, the chances of these houses having access to this trail was probably pretty minimal because of fencing, et cetera. So just by opening that up, this house is probably now worth more because it now has greater access to that trail. So you don't necessarily lose all of the value, the so-called value that a cul-de-sac has just because you're opening pedestrian and bike access up. And then just one final point, I think, on street connectivity is that even in areas where we can't, like the cul-de-sacs, connect for vehicular access, we can still provide access for bikes and peds. So this is a stream and a wetland going through the middle, and they've connected it through this little pathway. So there's still ways to take advantage and improve connectivity, even if it can't be for all modes. And then if for anyone who's interested in about a month or so, we'll be releasing a Utah Street Connectivity Guide, which provides guidelines for decision makers on why street connectivity is important, and then also provides information on how you can retrofit your communities with some case studies throughout the state on the benefits of street connectivity. So street connectivity only goes part of the way. We really need to have complete streets if people are going to access or use different modes. And complete streets just means streets for all anticipated users. So what that means is that if we don't necessarily need to provide bicycle and pedestrian access on freeways or divided highways, but if you think that pedestrians and bicyclists are likely to use a certain street, then we should be providing a safe space for them. And so what are some elements of a complete street? So these aren't everything you have to have on every street, but they're just some of the typical elements that might be used. So we want a place for pedestrians. We want sidewalks that are separated from the other uses. We want areas that are dedicated for bicyclists. Of course, we need to maintain vehicular access, but we want people to be able to safely cross the streets as well. And the one thing that's missing in this graphic is transit. So if you're in an area that has high transit use, you could potentially provide a separated space for transit. I'm going to give some examples of what complete streets are, and I'm going to start with the urban and work my way down. So if you're in a really urban area, you might consider separating, in addition to separating the pedestrians and providing like wide sidewalks for them, but you might even separate the bicycle use into their own facilities. And this is currently happening throughout the state in Salt Lake, Ogden. I think there's one planned down in Provo as well. So complete streets can work even if you're not that urban. So here's a typical main street that might be found throughout Utah. And you can see we still have the space for pedestrians. We're still providing a buffer from the pedestrians and the vehicular traffic through this planting strip, through on-street parking, and then providing a safe space for bicyclists while maintaining the traffic flow. And down here, we're providing safe crossings with these bulb outs and then a sign that's indicating that pedestrians are going to cross there. So you can still provide complete streets even in sort of non-urban areas. So these are 4 more suburban areas that may not have on-street parking, but we're still providing sidewalks that are buffered with on-street park or with a bike lane, and we can still provide left turn lanes in certain areas. Here you can see that there's like a freeway or an elevated road, and that doesn't mean that we need to also not provide access. We can still provide sidewalks, and there's a big enough shoulder for bicyclists to safely bike, although not ideal probably on the bicyclist part. But so even in rural areas, we can provide complete streets. So on the image on the left, we're probably not likely to see a pedestrian on that road. There's no land uses around. It looks pretty rural. So we don't necessarily need to provide a separated space for them, but there may be bicyclists. So even wide shoulders can be considered part of complete streets. If you're anticipating both pedestrians and bicyclists in a rural area, you can always do a side running mixed-use path. Just going back to why complete streets are important. So one of the main reasons we do complete streets is to provide more safety. And this is from our street connectivity study. We were trying to figure out how people pick pedestrian and bicycling routes. And in both cases, the majority of people are picking those routes based on safety. And so if we can provide safer streets, then people are more likely to be able to use the options that they want to use. Let's briefly touch on this. So this shows, although this is data for the Wasatch Front, this is pretty similar to numbers throughout the state and numbers throughout the country, showing that about half of our trips are less than 3 miles. 3 miles is a pretty decent bike ride. I mean, you're going slow 20 minutes, so it's between 10 and 20-minute bike ride. People are willing to do that. You can see there's a spike in the less than 1 mile trip length, which is a 20-minute walk trip, right? So there's this huge untapped market here for pedestrian and bike trips. The people we saw before want to be able to use those modes, but can't use those modes either because our street networks are disconnected, our land uses are too far away, or our streets aren't safe. And if we can provide those 3 things, then we can provide quality communities. The name of this course. See the tie there? And I just wanted to give you a heads up. I know not everyone that's watching is within the Wasatch Front, but if you are, then the Wasatch Front Regional Council in Salt Lake County has a grant program that can help develop plans for either land use, can help develop plans for improved connectivity, and can help develop plans for complete streets ordinances. And this is a grant program that has applications every year. And if you want more information, you can go to wfrc.org/TLC. And then I guess it's question time. Nice. Do we see it? Okay. You want this?
I guess we're going to pass this around. All right, we've got about 25 minutes before they shut down the technology. So, but at this point, I'm going to invite all our presenters back up, and we're going to take questions. You can aim your question at one of them or at all of them. We'll start right here. And remember, I think you got to push your button, right? Got to push your button so people can. The A button.
Yeah, I just wanted to relate an experience I had. Our neighborhood was having some infill development. A developer came in. It was in Salt Lake, and we tried to work with the developer to put in some more walkable aspects to it. Maybe some small commercial spaces, things like that. We got the city planner in Salt Lake involved. We got a pro bono architect to help design, the space for him. And the developer just wouldn't budge. And this is about 10 years ago, and we thought we had everything covered. The whole neighborhood was behind it. Salt Lake City planning, pro bono architecture, and the developer just said, "I'm used to building single-family homes. That's all I'm going to do. That's all the financing that I can get. I'm not interested in really going any further than that." So we weren't able to get that through. This was about maybe 12 years ago. So I think it's changing now. But I was just going to see if you guys had any opinion, that it is changing and that the financing aspect of it is becoming more used to, multi-use kind of hubs.
As I said during my presentation, there's always market conditions, right? Even in Santaquin, when we started looking at how can we get more higher density in our core area of town, a lot of people said, there's no way. Well, the last 4 projects that have come into downtown Santaquin have been townhome projects or multifamily because we opened up the ordinance and there's a market for it. But again, we're in an area where it's the fastest growing community and the fastest growing county. It's understanding that there are times and circumstances where it's allowed. And going to the financing of mixed use projects in particular, historically, when you look at a mixed use building from a city standpoint, you're looking at, well, there's commercial and there's residential. From a financing standpoint, they look at it and say, that's a multifamily project that might have a commercial element to it. And is there a market for that multifamily aspect? So things are changing. You know, you look out the window and you can see amazing condominium project at 3-story, and in the Salt Lake market that might work, but I can't get a 3-story the whole block condition in Santa Clara. It is timing.
I just want to speak a little bit about markets across the Wasatch Front. We looked at building permits for the last, I think, 6-7 years for the 4 counties along the Wasatch Front. So we were down to Utah. And historically, it's been about 70% multifamily. In the last 6, 7, 8 years since the recession hit, it's been 50-50. And no sign yet that it's going to shift back. So there is some change going on in the market. All right, Andrew.
First, I just want to say thank you to Envision Utah and all the presenters for taking time out on a Saturday to do this training. All the presentations were really terrific, so thank you. The question is probably initially directed at Wilf about parking, but I'd be open to hearing anybody's opinions. Wilf, you were talking about parking standards often being too high, and there's sort of a chicken and egg relationship here with the municipal parking standards and then what the business expectations are. So how do you break that cycle? You know, because it seems that the municipalities are responding to requests to reduce, or the idea of reducing parking standards by saying, well, we can't do that because the businesses want it, and then the businesses or the developers are often saying, well, we can't reduce parking because the ordinances are requiring it. So how do you deal with that kind of chicken and egg relationship?
Yeah, it's, you know, it's, you kind of wind up going back and forth for a little bit. When I was in Salt Lake City, where we had a lot of commercial development, a lot of discussion about parking, the city was very proactive in wanting to get that parking level down. And so we actually did adopt standards and ordinances that would reduce the amount of parking that was required. And I think part of that was the attitude of the public and the education of the local officials and the benefits that they could see from having the reduced parking. The interesting thing that happened then is when we went to the businesses, we thought they'd be in favor of that because it would mean less area they would have to devote to parking or so on. Oftentimes the business themselves, but more often than that, the business would say, we can't get it financed if we have less than this amount of parking. Because the financiers are saying, oh, you're going to need this amount of parking so you can get this amount of business, therefore making your payments. And so it's kind of an education not only of the developers, but also of the financing of the development. And it's coming. You know, as you look around, I mean, you have organizations like the Urban Land Institute and others, AIA architects that are out there saying to these developers and builders, you can do this at a lower standard. So it's something that's coming. It takes time. You know, I oftentimes have used the analogy in making changes in land use that it's like turning an oil tanker, a super tanker. It takes a lot of time and a lot of distance, but eventually you get there. And I think that's what's happening with the parking standards. It's coming. It's just slow.
Just to add to that really quickly, and if you're wanting mixed use or higher density downtown, one thing to think about if you already have a street system is, are you willing to allow on-street parking to count toward the use? If you think about it, people are parking there anyways. Why not allocate some of that toward the use that's coming in for infill? And you have to be careful. We went through an issue where we finally said, okay, all the residential components to mixed use has to be on site, but definitely all the commercial businesses, we would let them use on-street parking to count toward that parking requirement, which really helps.
I don't even know how to use this. So I have a question for Patrick about the LDS Church's ability to let us use their parking lots. We're building some new space in Santa Clara right next to an LDS church that has an empty parking lot all the time. What does the churches feel about that? What's involved in those types of situations, and how realistic is it for us to be able to share, lease, or use that parking space?
Great question. Let me give a political answer. Just kidding. But it depends. Really, I would just say engage with us in conversation. Like I had mentioned in my presentation, I think the best thing to do is to get the stakeholders at the table to discuss what the plans are why the request is being made to do a shared use agreement, and then we can talk about the details of what that shared use agreement might look like and what makes sense. Yeah, I'm definitely the one to talk to. So reach out to me. I'm sure they'll send out our contact information or, yeah, so. Yes.
I see developments that are rather small, that are considered mixed use. They'll have some office, some maybe a hotel, retail, etc. And I'm thinking of a couple that are on the order of 45 to 55 acres. Is there a critical mass that you need before something really does work as a mixed-use community?
At times it comes down, again, market, I mean, that's a general term, but usually it's the land value has to get to a point that it doesn't make any sense to develop it other than to take advantage of the land cost. And so, again, if you look at the amount, if you look at mixed use, primarily the multifamily development first, that creates a little bit of a shift in, is there enough, I mean, when a mixed use development comes in, usually it's the housing that they're going to get a lot of money back from. So is there enough of a market for the multifamily aspect to make that work? And usually it's, again, what are the market conditions you have in the area for housing? Is there enough job growth being created to bring in the demographic that wants that kind of housing? Are you in a young millennial group that is okay with just having an apartment for a little while? Is there enough of that going on? Or are you still in an area where you've got young families that now have 2 or 3 kids that need a little backyard space? And it really depends on where you're at and what's happening overall with your economy.
Yeah, if you're looking at mixed use, you kind of have to look at all the different markets. So the retail component, if there's already enough retail to serve all the rooftops around, then you do need a critical mass of new residential to support that retail. But if there's not enough retail to support the existing households, then you may already have a market there. So similar with the office and so on. And if you're on the Wasatch Front, there probably already is a market for residential everywhere in your city. So. Yeah.
Ask a question.
That will already support form-based zoning. Then how do you get the public? Because you talked about your stakeholders initially coming together, but the public was left out of that. How do you get the public to agree to the higher density without getting all these initiatives and all of these after the fact kind of problems?
Yeah, the magic bullet solution.
Yeah, you've asked a $64,000 question because, you know, as Envision Utah has noted with their survey, people generally say, oh yeah, we support these concepts. We think it's a good idea until it shows up in the neighborhood next door to them, you know, and then they say, well, you know, that's a good idea for someplace else, but not next door to us. And that's really, that's a tough one. Just keep engaging the community is probably just the best answer, is keep talking to them, keep, you know, trying to make them aware of these the issues, the concepts, and what the effects are and the benefits. But even doing that, you know, there's no guarantee that when a development comes in that the neighborhood's going to be very happy about it, because while they in theory like the idea, they think it's a good concept overall, not next door to them. And that's always a tough one, and that's a tough one to deal with.
Yeah, I think. Right. Yeah, I think along those lines of until it's built and they actually like it, it's going to take time, obviously. And I think one of the things that's going to take time is proving that working together and creating a product or a quality community actually works in the long term. And that's going to take time. I mean, I look at Daybreak. Daybreak, not saying it's the ideal community, but I've lost count how many developers have contacted me and said, hey, we're building another Daybreak type development. So everybody wants to build Daybreak, I guess. But it takes time for individuals to see that, oh yeah, that is what I want to live in. And it's about that preserving choice. Because why do you think the suburbs are growing? It's because a lot of people are leaving maybe Salt Lake or cities because they want more space or that type of thing. And so if you start proposing density in those spaces, of course it's going to get pushed back. They're saying, I just left that area and now you're bringing it to my backyard again. And that's why a better model of planning that preserves the open space, that preserves the connectivity and the choice and those things, and proving the benefits of that is going to take time, but showing that I think is going to start allowing for less community pushback.
Can we ask a question in Orem? Can you guys hear us?
Go ahead.
This question is for Dennis. When you've been looking at you did your block study, and you said, okay, if we increase the number of housing units in this block, we're not actually, adding a bunch of additional infrastructure that's with your streets and your sewer lines. Were there any other additional city services, however, that would cost the city money, even by just adding the individuals, the population growth, even if it's not infrastructure that's developing itself?
Yeah, that's a good question. Even to the townhome scenario that I showed on the presentation, you'd probably still have to add another 500 feet of sewer line, but maybe that's going to be the same line that you have to install for single-family homes or townhomes. It's just a matter of how much capacity you want to put in there. But other services for cities that provide police and fire, you're probably going to go up. And for instance, our police cost right now per household is about $557 per house, and our fire and EMS is about $160 per house. That cost, if we're going to maintain a level of service that we want, is probably not going to change. And so across the board, per unit, that's going to stay the same. That's why I didn't include it in the numbers. But you can take advantage of capacities within your infrastructure, which I think is a critical, important point to understand.
I was going to say something about the parking, which was one of the easiest ways to fix the parking problem fast, is to have your big box stores at the edge of the street with a sidewalk. And then you put the parking behind them, and then at least people can cross the street from one big box to the other big box and leave their cars alone. It's not a fix permanently, but it's a method. And one of you showed a picture of stores on an old-fashioned town square with entries to the backs of the stores, the hollow behind, and that's a very effective fix for some of the parking. That was all I was trying to say.
Do I need to push it?
As long as the green light's on, you're good.
So if I might talk about the cul-de-sacs more, my name is Dirk Burton, I'm in West Jordan, and we have a lot to do with this. We have the infill, we have the open areas, and we just had some people come that had a cul-de-sac. They had a sidewalk going out of the cul-de-sac over onto a main road, 7800 South, and they wanted that closed off because they said that the police can't get the bad guys when they're trying to run away from them going through there. So we reluctantly gave them permission to close it off. And then we have someone doing an infill, just putting some cul-de-sacs in, and they're butting up to a street that stopped right there.
Like a sub street? Or...
Right, it was an existing street, they just stopped. And they were butting up to there, but they weren't going to connect to it because the existing people have an HOA. And they said, we don't want anyone, them, and that new development coming through our subdivision. So we want that closed off. And then on the other side of that same subdivision, because they're doing that infill, it's right on Redwood Road. UDOT says we don't want more intersections on Redwood Road there, so you have to go over to this other street that's already connected onto Redwood Road. So that counters all the things that you were kind of telling me about during your presentation.
Right. Okay, so we're going to start with that question. So, I mean, as far as the UDOT intersections on Redwood Road, I mean, they do have standards, right, that each intersection or each access point has to be a certain distance away. So they're unlikely to give you a variance for that unless there's a really good compelling reason. for the connecting into the next subdivision, I don't know, what you said, wait, I forgot the city. West Jordan. So I mean, I think it would be helpful, and I don't know if West Jordan has ordinances that lay out connectivity standards or layout. Okay. And can you not use those? I mean, there should be something in that forces the next development to come in, I mean, and to use that substreet.
We require an entrance, two entrances to the subdivision in and out. The one will permit to be gated so the fire department can get through, and we force them to put a gate there so the fire can have fire access. So they reluctantly gave in to that, but they didn't even want that. They just wanted to have the street blocked off completely so the new subdivision wouldn't drive through their subdivision. And that was what their desires were, because they are a gated community and this new one isn't, and they didn't want to have them connected into there. So we put a gate there, which left them with just one.
You are the only participant.
Because the whole other part was Redwood Road, so only gave them one entrance out.
So, never been a city planner myself. I'm going to turn to Wilf and ask if you know more about like enforcing that or
HOAs and gated communities.
Well, gated communities, yeah, I mean, that's a whole different, that's a concept in and of itself. Just so you know my bias, I am against gated communities. I don't like them because they isolate parts of the community from each other. I understand the draw that some people have for them, and I guess we're going to wind up with them in some places, but I think as far as building community, they're terrible because they isolate. People that live in them are isolated from the rest of the community, and the rest of the community can't get to them. If you're LDS at all, I always think, how do you get your home features in there? You know, it's just, it's not a good situation. Maybe so. You just have them that live within the but with regard to what you were saying, like what the police saying and so on too, a common standard that you see is that you say you have to have streets that are this wide and no longer than this without a dead end because of the fire department. You know, they got to get their fire truck down there. They got to be able to set it up, and you don't want them to have back it out. How much sense does it make to design your whole community for something that may happen once every 20 years? You know, that they may accidentally go down the wrong road and have to back out or do something. It doesn't make any sense. And in fact, there was a whole series of, there was a guy who was a Boston Fire Department employee or a fireman who, you know, kind of disparaged that whole concept. He said, look, it's, you know, it's not true. And so we really got to look at what we're being asked to do here and how it affects the rest of the community and what is it that we're trying to accomplish. And you kind of got to, we had a situation in one of the communities up in Davis County where it was a city engineer who'd been around for a long time, and he was requiring every time that these streets be way wide. And, you know, at one point we finally got the concept through because it was right near Hill Air Force Base saying, you keep doing this and the planes are going to start landing on the streets in the town rather than on the base. You know, what does it do to the rest of your community? Does it make sense? And look at it from that standpoint. With HOAs, existing HOAs, it's tough because they've already got that situation. They are paying for the maintenance of that road, and then to open it up and allow traffic to run through it, what you probably ought to look at a community at that point is then taking over the roads, because then it essentially becomes a public street. If it isn't a public street, I think the HOA has a good point, but don't get yourself in that box in the first place, and don't allow it to happen that way to begin with. And that's my opinion. Yeah.
This is only tangentially related, but you mentioned the connectivity to Redwood Road, and you think about those major arterials through your city, you know, whether it's Redwood Road, 90th South, 78th South. Those of us on the Wasatch Front realize those arterials are all congested at 5 o'clock, right? And you think about why that is, it's because all of these subdivisions that connect to those roads don't connect anywhere else, and the only way people can travel is on those arterials. So if there were other ways to get through, we wouldn't see those same kind of congestion patterns at peak hours.
So are you suggesting more entrances onto the road, or how are you saying more ways to get through?
Talking about all of these subdivisions that are connected to Redwood Road, if they were connected themselves and there were alternative paths as instead of Redwood Road, then the traffic could disperse more.
It's changing, but historically and generally, UDOT's purpose is get a car or a vehicle from point A to point B in as little time as possible with as little hindrance as possible, which is why some of their standards are in place that let's only have intersections so many feet away from each other so we can get the cars through the area. There is some shifts, and they are looking more at how do we create trails and bikes and different things. They are looking at the complete streets aspect, but UDOT streets, state streets are a whole different animal to what you can do as a city.
So in the Utah Street Connectivity Study that should be coming out soon, we looked at the benefits so we took 3 cities, Lehigh, Layton, and Erda, West Erda, and compared if we increase connectivity versus if we increase the capacity of major roads, keeping travel time the same throughout the network. And what we saw was if you increase capacity, you actually have more network-wide. If you can increase street connectivity, you actually have more network-wide capacity in the system than if you just increase more lane mile. So going from a 4 to a 6-lane arterial, for instance. You also reduce travel. Well, the travel times were kept the same. So you reduce the number of vehicle trips that happen within the network because now people can shift modes. So you also had reduced BMT. That's important to you. And so there was actually, in all cases, in the performance measures that we were looking at, the connected networks performed better than the widening numbers, even though the per street capacity was higher in the widening because, right, we have wider streets. So that's going to Ari's point that if we can connect, if we have better connections between, say, 70th and 78th, that the amount of traffic that's on 70th and 78th will reduce because they're better distributed throughout the network.
Were you suggesting driving through the subdivisions instead of going onto the other roads?
Well, yeah, I mean, ideally, in your case, it's tough because you're pretty much built out, but in new situations, like maybe the audience out there, setting up those new roads and those blocks before development comes in is a lot easier than going back and trying to figure out how to connect streets or connect neighborhoods and then explaining to those neighborhoods that, hey, more people are going to be driving in front of your house. But you can also do things to reduce speeds, right? You can do bulb outs and traffic calming, speed bumps, but still just providing another option that instead of sitting on traffic on 78th, you can drive 30 miles an hour down the street with 4, speed bumps. It might still be faster for you than sitting in the traffic. But if you're already built out within that block, yeah, it can be difficult to connect for automobile access.
I think we're going to lose these satellite locations any second now, right? So I think we're going to close at this point. Those of you who are here, we're still here available to answer questions. So, but thank you everybody for participating on a snowy, wintry day. Hopefully you got some good takeaways from this. And as you can see, obviously, when the rubber meets the road, it always isn't always quite as easy as it sounds. But thank you, everybody.